How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. Not too bad at all. So is that head cold coming right?
It's incubating very well, thank you. I've still got my head cold, which I had at the last recording, but these things are sent to testers. Thankfully, it's not COVID.
Well, that's good, isn't it? We don't want any of that silly old nonsense, do we? Definitely not at your age.
Yes, thank you very much.
That's always a pleasure, never a chore. So, mate, what are we going to talk about today then?
Well, you mentioned age. I guess when we were around about 15, we would have thought, what am I going to do with life? For us, it was we want to go to sea and join the Royal Navy. And that's a process and a half from the decision to getting recruited and then getting down to HMS Raleigh down in Plymouth. What do you remember of that process?
So, I was at school and I was 14, and a petty officer came to speak to our class about opportunities in the services. He's a PO stoker, petty officer stoker. He was a real little guy and he was real gruff and he'd lost half of his teeth. And he came in and he spoke to us, as I was about 14 years old, about joining up the Royal Navy. And I listened to him, and I can remember being sat in the classroom listening to him thinking, you know what, I wouldn't mind having a crack at that. I was never very academic. I'm probably not the brightest star in the sky and certainly not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And so I knew that I was never going to have a career at school. So I thought to myself, at 16, I could probably go and join up. So that's how I was initially attracted to the Royal Navy, from this petty officer. I can remember his name, I can remember everything about him. And he was the one who sort of first laid it out as a possibility. What about you? How did you come first to sort of gauge, this could be an opportunity in the Royal Navy, before we even get to applying, before we even get to anything else? How did that come about? What hooked you to even start that process?
Well, there's a couple of memories I have. My Uncle Stephen.
Great name.
When I was about,
Uncle Stevens are the best uncles.
He was in the Navy, and his first ever ship was HMS Aurora.
Oh, really?
When it first being commissioned.
Love the synergy.
Yeah. My first ship was HMS Aurora. And I remember him coming home and having these stories of the sea. And that alone was exotic. And he mentioned these words, Portland, Portsmouth, Plymouth. I thought, what is that? Well, of course, I then lost contact with him because my mum got divorced. He was the brother of my proper father. But he always fixed in my mind. And then, I don't know the exact year, I'm hypothesising around about 1976, 77. The BBC documentary Sailor came on.
Yeah.
And it was about the Ark Royal. And it was that wonderful opening music
by
Rod Stewart. But what really got me was there was this long moment. In fact, when it was re-released years later, because of copyright, they couldn't have the same music. And it was Pink Floyd, Shine On You, Crazy Diamond. And it was that long, slow introduction where they were showing the planes coming up onto the flight deck and then taking off. And I thought, I've got to join it. I've got to go and do that. Remember we talked about going on holiday in the Zephyr down to Cornwall?
Yep.
Well, when we were down there, my stepdad desperately needed some money. So we had to rush back, and the nearest bank he could get it in was Plymouth. And for some reason, we got lost, and we ended up going past the dockyard. There's some of these big burly fellows coming out. And my dad said, look at these fellows, because he knew I loved the Navy. He said, you'll be like one of those one day. And that stuck in my mind. And I think all that combined, I just knew I had to join the Navy. And the bizarre thing about me joining the Navy is if you look at a map of England, I lived 1 mile from the spot that was the furthest from the sea. And I knew I just had to get away and join the Navy. And so I did, as soon as I could.
Funny, isn't it? When I was a young chap as well, probably around about the same sort of time as I'd met this petty officer, but we went on holiday down to Cornwall, and I went to a little bric-a-brac shop, little junk shop like they have in sort of old fishing type villages, full of tat and stuff like that. And I bought, my eye got caught on 2 Chief Petty Officer cap badges, which have got the fouled anchor on it and the wreath and the crown and all the rest of it. And in fact, as I talk to you, I am looking at them. They are pinned to my board up here.
Of course. This is you, Steve. Of course you'd have them.
Of course I've got them. They're pinned right here, just out of my eyesight here. I don't know, there was just something about the anchor, there was something about the look, and it's all built into this thing of perhaps, applying for the Royal Navy. But I didn't tell anybody that I'd applied.
Oh,
I got all of the application forms. So my parents hadn't got a clue. So I'm 15 by now, and my parents hadn't got a clue that I had applied to the Royal Navy. The first they knew about it, it was in January, so it was quite cold. We were sat at breakfast, and a manila envelope comes through the door addressed to me, on Her Majesty's service. And of course, my dad picks it up and he looks at it and he says, "This is for you, boy." I went, "Oh, right, thanks, Dad." And he hands it across to me, and I just carry on eating my cereal. And then by this time, Mum and Dad are a little bit, why are you getting stuff on Her Majesty's service? What's all that about? I said, "I'll have a look." And so I opened it up and I pulled out all the paperwork. I said, "Oh, it's because I've got an interview to join the Royal Navy at the end of the month." And you can see they nearly choked on their breakfast. What do you mean? When did you do this? How did that happen? I said, "Oh, well, I applied and I've got an interview."
I'm assuming we must have had our parents' permission.
You had to have parental permission once they offered you a position. So I could go for the interviews without anyone knowing. I could go through all of the process. But as soon as they offered you a position, you had to be signed over because petty officer. Can I mention his name? Am I allowed to do that?
Well, you tell me. You know the legal side.
Yeah, well, Petty Officer Parkin. He was a petty officer at the time. Petty Officer Parkin. He then got promoted because by the time he came back, he was a chief petty officer, and he turned up at our doorstep about 4 months later. So May. He turned up at the doorstep in May. Prior to that, he had told my mother, "Don't worry, yes, he's passed all the rest of it, but it's going to be about 2 years before we can get him in." And so, he'll be about pushing towards, late 17, 18. But then in May, he turned up, hangs on the door. My mum opens the door, and I'm sort of stood behind her. And he says, "Hello, Mrs. Hutt. I'm the man that you don't want to see." And she sort of looked at him and said, "Oh, come on in then." So, of course, he trots in. And he said, "Right, you've been accepted, and there's a slot for you in July." This was May. So
what year?
It's 83. So it's just so I guess it's probably due to the Falklands. Actually, it's probably due to the Falklands War. Recruiting and building up the fleet and doing all of that sort of stuff. So I was in by July 83.
Wow.
That's 16 in 1 month.
A vivid memory. There was 3 of us. We went on a bus into Leicester.
Yeah.
Because we lived about 14 miles outside. And it was a big day. Went down and we obviously went to the recruitment office. I can't remember where it was. It might have been Charles Street. And there was a guy who was turned down. He wanted to be a Marine, but he, for some reason, either too small or they recommended he bulk out a bit and come back. I remember having a conversation with a Marine Corporal, and he did some paperwork. We had to do the NAMIT test, which I failed miserably on the maths. Useless. I had to sit it again, and I'm not convinced I even passed it then, but they wanted people in. This would have been late 79, because I joined in October of 80. And then the other guy joined the army. We almost joined the forces at the same time, and when I used to go on leave for Christmas for the first couple of years, I'd see him. He joined a Scottish regiment. He had these wonderful kilt and stuff. Oz, he was called. Lived in the same village. But I don't remember much after that, apart from the fact I got bored waiting. But I also kind of gave up because I got accepted before my final exams, and I thought, well, I don't need to bother. So therefore, I failed miserably at most of my exams.
Yeah, snap.
And then, of course, the paperwork arrived. I don't know if it was the same time. A blue book, which part of our kit, you had to fold clothes to be that size. Do you remember? Don't tell me you've got it. Oh, my God.
Got the book somewhere, Mark. It was the Naval Ratings Handbook, and all of your kit had to be folded to that size.
And you've got it, of course.
I don't know how old the book was, but there was old pictures about where things are on the ship, and you had to learn the terms and all that. And I was fascinated with it.
You're absolutely right.
And then, handing over to you, came the medicals.
Yes, the medicals, they were interesting, weren't they? Cough and drop type thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me just cut your hair. Cough.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you're all right. Move along. Yeah, medicals, went through the medicals, few little queries here and there that they had to have a little look around at, but otherwise it was all pretty good and medicals were all done. But going through that process, and I don't know about your careers office for the Royal Navy where you were, but ours was joint, so it was with the RAF, so it was a Royal Navy and Royal Air Force careers office. And then a couple of blocks down, you had the Army careers office. I hedged my bets, so I would also apply to the RAF and the Army as well as the Royal Navy, but the Navy was the first one with an interview. So I went and did the Navy interview. They told me, "Yep, you're all good. We'll give you a chance, and then we'll get you on the medicals." At the same time, the RAF invited me for interviews. Basically, I sat down there and they said, "So why do you want to be in the Air Force?" And I said, "Well, I don't really. I'm just interested in joining the services." And that was not the right answer. So I then told them that I had been accepted for the Royal Navy through their interview process. And he just sort of folded up the paperwork then and said, "Well, I suggest you join the Royal Navy then." And so I said, "Oh, okay then." And that was that, because it was just one of those things, I was hedging my bets, and I thought, oh, well, I'll just crack on with the Royal Navy then. It's been there in my mind anyway, so just crack on with it. And then that process of it looming, the day looming. Do you remember anything about the night before when you got on that train? I'm presuming you got on a train and you would have probably ended up at Paddington on the way to Plymouth.
So I had to go via Birmingham and then down to Plymouth.
Right.
I was seen off from the station, it's Hinckley, with my parents. It would have been almost 40 years later when Joe and I, my wife, went back to the UK in 2017. We came up from Plymouth on the train to Birmingham, and we got off at Hinckley. And my dad said, "That's the first time I've seen you come off the train since we said goodbye to you when you joined the Navy." I would have been on the train to Birmingham on my own. For some reason, I met up with someone. I can't remember if we were given kit bags or those green Pussers suitcases to go with us. But I recognised someone had something similar because I got talking to them and he was joining the Navy. And we talked all the way down, convincing ourselves we're going to be okay and bolstering ourselves because we was very nervous. About 16? October 1980. I don't remember the night before, but I remember the one advice my dad gave me. And I always followed it. And he said, take every day as it comes. It was fantastic advice, actually.
It's good life advice, full stop, mate. Good life advice. I got on the train and went up to London, across into London to Paddington, and my dad came with me into London because, I say, I was only just turned 16. I have vivid memories of there weren't any seats by the platform, but there was almost like the bicycle rails, like these sort of big metal railings, and they were sort of at bum level, and we both parked ourselves on resting on that. He was very quiet. He didn't really know what to say to me. And he says, "Would you like a coffee?" I went, "Yeah, thanks, Dad." And I remember watching him walk off to get a coffee and then coming back. And it's that very uncomfortable period when you as a dad are saying cheerio to one of your sons and you don't quite know where to put yourself, that sort of thing. And particularly when you are a man of a certain era who doesn't quite know how to, "Well, very good, lad, all the best." There's, I'd throw my arms around my boys and I'd hug them and say, "Oh, I love you to bits, son. You look after yourself." But my father was not the huggy, throwing his arms around, "I love you, son" type of chap. So that was quite interesting. But I could see that he was visibly upset about me leaving, really quite upset in the way that he shows his emotions like that, which has always sort of stuck with me. And I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. Yeah, interesting. And then I jump on the train and head down to Plymouth from Paddington. And I got sat on a 4-seat with a table in the centre.
Yeah.
And a young woman got on with 2 young kids who were sat sort of one next to me and one opposite, and then she was sat directly opposite me. And I'm dressed quite smart, in that typical early 80s fashion, quite smart. And she eventually started to chat to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm heading down to join the Royal Navy." And she said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh, my dad's in the Royal Navy." I said, "Oh, okay." And I think he was a Master at Arms. So he was, And so she sort of chatted to me, and I think she just tried to put me at my ease because she could probably see that I was absolutely terrified. That every stop I was looking at, is this Plymouth? Is this Plymouth? Is this Plymouth? Type of thing. I'd never travelled very far. I'd certainly not travelled far on my own. That was the longest journey I'd ever done on my own. And that might sound really strange to people today. You think, "What, you're 16 and you'd never travelled far?" I'm thinking, mate, no, I hadn't. The boundary of my village was my domain, and anything on a bus was like, ooh. Anything on a train was, and anything on an aeroplane was, well, that doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen.
It's worth bearing in mind, back in 1980, that would have cost a fortune. We got given it free. We got a travel warrant, didn't we? I handed it over to the ticket guy, and I thought, "You're not going to know what this is." And he knew instantly. He's seen enough of them, stamped it, off you go. Couldn't afford it. And I guess then the Navy has to do that because you wouldn't turn up otherwise. It's a long way.
Yeah, it is. It was a long journey. And I can remember arriving at Plymouth and getting off, and there being a sailor stood there with a blackboard. And he was in half blue, so he had his white hat on, and he had his white front, and he had his number 2 trousers.
Yeah.
So the sort of flared trousers. And he was just sort of, you look like, and you can obviously spot new recruits sort of coming off with their shiny shoes and looking spick and span type of thing. You here for a HMS Raleigh? I said, yes, I am. He said, right, stand there. And then before you knew it, we had a number of people. They'd obviously did a head count. And then we were shuffled onto a bus and driven down to Tor Point, to Raleigh.
It was similar to me, and it was the longest trip I'd ever done on my own. As we were getting towards Plymouth, I remember it being tannoid. My guts tightened. Oh, God, here we are. And the guy I was talking to went quiet, and we bundled off the train. Never been to Plymouth Station before, and it's quite a fairly big open place, hanging around, not knowing what to do. And it was only when we thought, well, we better walk to the entrance. And when we got to the entrance, the guy was there with a Sherpa van. Mm-hmm. There was already 3 or 4 guys there as well. There was one guy I thought it was ancient. He was about 25. I thought granddad. And then, like you say, down to the Tor Point ferry. And as we went across the Tor Point ferry, we could see naval ships. And I was literally petrified. I thought, oh, God, is that what we're going to go on and all that? And I thought, it was only then I thought, oh, right, okay, what's ahead? Not I want to go home, but it's like, it's real now. I can see what we're going to move into as a life. And like you, I guess, we ended up in Antony at Raleigh.
Absolutely, at Raleigh. Goodness me, I hated that place. I don't know about you, but I absolutely hated it. It was such a shell shock for me, coming from a small little rural background in nowhere near the sea, a bit like yourself. I mean, I lived inland, and to be thrown into that. There were around about 70 recruits probably on my intake. I kept a diary, and I have my diary of 19.
You never cease to amaze me, Steve. Have you written down your entry? Who it was? Was it like Boscawen and 42 or something?
Probably will have in here somewhere, but I haven't sort of looked through all of that. What I put in, on day one, it was just getting there, 70 odd people, really a little bit uncomfortable with all of this. And one of the things I remember them saying was, your kit's all out there. If it doesn't fit, chuck it in the left-hand side of your locker. That was the term that they used. If your kit doesn't fit, chuck it in the left-hand side of your locker. So the left-hand side of my locker was completely full of kit because nothing fitted me because I was such a little titch that just everything, the trousers hung off me, the shirts were too big for me. Then the next day, I was up at 5:30 and that's when they dragged us into the barber's to shave our heads.
Yeah.
And they gave us a mean crew cut. And it was the same jumper. Do you remember the jumper? So you had
they itch.
But you had the same civvy jumper that was taken off you and given to the next guy who then sat there. He had his hair cut. You then moved to have your passport photograph taken, and it was the same passport jumper that everybody wore.
Mm.
I've got a note here referring to my hair. It is incredibly short. You can see my head through it. I mean, I was quite horrified. I liked Motorhead back in the day with long hair, and. Yeah, and then on day 3 there, Mark, we ended up in the lecture room where we were lectured on VD, alcohol, and smoking.
Yeah, yeah.
We saw a video, and there was a guy who was being interviewed, and he looked in his late 70s, slightly deranged, and it was filmed in the 1950s. Funnily enough, out in Alexandria. Turns out he suffered from 3rd-degree syphilis, which he'd caught off a woman while on run ashore. Never told anybody. And they said, and that's what happens if you do something similar. 16-year-old looking at the screen think, oh.
And some very attractive photographs, I think, of various appendages with horrible cauliflower things growing on them and goodness knows what else. And by the way, when you go to the Far East, you'll meet ladies who look like this, but they are not ladies, that type of thing.
Yes, that's especially out in Singapore, ladyboys, yeah.
Yeah. I think they referred to them as kaitais, didn't they? Kaitais, I think they called them back in the day.
Yeah,
so it was quite amazing. And on that same day, day 3, according to my little diary here, we did the assault course. And that was really interesting for me because that was the first time that I suddenly realised that I was not in a holiday camp at all, like significantly not, because I can remember coming across this assault course, and you'd get across the final rope pull across the sort of little trench type thing that you had to pull yourself across, commando crawl across, and then you had to fall in. And I sort of fell in with the rest. I was probably slower than a lot of the kids there because I was little and scrawny and all the rest of it. And I fell in, and I put so much effort into it that I was heaving, and I'm stood there, and I'm like this behind the guy in front of me, and the fleet chief, warrant officers now, he came up to the side of me and he leant in and he goes, "Swallow it." And I'm like, and he says, "Swallow it." And so I sort of swallow it all back down. And then he smacks me in the head as we're doubling back. And I thought to myself, yeah, this is nice.
Welcome to the Navy.
Welcome to the Andrew, old son. And that was that. So my very early impressions. I didn't like rally at all.
No.
Although we'll have to do an episode on the training. You talked about diminutive with similar size. I think you're slightly taller than me. I joined, and on my record it says 5'6 3/4. I grew to 5'8", but my original uniform that I came out the Navy with, my daughter couldn't fit into when she was 11. But anyway, that's by the by. For me...
Do you still have that uniform?
What do you think? No.
Do you think I do?
Do you? Oh, God. Unbelievable. For me, it was a shock. I was similar because, as a kid growing up, you don't have to get up at 5:30 in the morning to get washed and ready for scran, breakfast. We were kept in the building that we first went into for a week or two. You weren't allowed... They take you off marching and stuff, but you was kept there. They said it was to get you used to being on a ship. I don't think it was. I think it was to stop you running off.
It was certainly to stop you doing a runner, I reckon. It was. Yeah. To acclimatise you to being cooped up, but to keep you so that you couldn't do a runner. I'm sure you're right. Don't let those little blighters out too far because they won't be coming back.
We were 16. I can't get over it because as a teacher, I've taught 16-year-olds, and I thought I wouldn't put you anywhere near a naval training or any training whatsoever. But there we were, and you had to get used to it very, very quickly. But I didn't hate rally, but I was glad to leave it. The problem I had, and it's something we will probably talk about when we do naval training, is that when we passed out, we had to stay in rally because we couldn't go straight onto Mercury in Portsmouth for about 10 days. And we went to an abandoned building there. And that was odd. It was almost as though they parked us to one side. They didn't seem to know what to do with us for a week before we got on transport and went off for the further training. But I was glad to say goodbye because it was freezing cold. I was there October till about late November, and I was just glad to say goodbye to the place.
Wasn't my favourite place, rally, I must admit. But then again, when we got to Mercury was not my favourite place initially either because the contrast. So rally was quite modern in standards back in the 80s, and Mercury was anything but.
Almost World War II.
World War II era. So that was another shock to the system with signals training as well. But that's a slightly different thing.
So there may be some old naval fellas listening. We never went to Ganges. We met guys in the ships that had gone to Ganges. If half the stories are true, I think we'd dodged a bullet.
Oh, mate, absolutely. I've got no doubt about that. Let's face it, everything evolves and most things do improve over time, don't they? So, I mean, even when I went back to Mercury on my last post, it had improved in the previous 8 years since I'd been there. So the difference between Ganges and Rally would have been incomparable. And the old Ganges lads, yeah, good on them. I think Rally was bad enough for my little mind.
We had similar kind of experiences getting to Rally.
Yeah, very similar, mate.
That's nice.
Well, that's like a surprise, isn't it?
Not really.
We seem to have done very similar things anyway, apart from the careers we did differently.
How we did it. And as I say, it's all changed now, I'm sure, and so we're just swinging the lantern, aren't we, really? But that's good.
Yeah, that's right.
So have a good new year.
And you, old friend.
Hopefully your resolutions will come true.
Yeah, well, let's hope so, hey? May all your dreams come true but one, as the Arabs would say.
All right, well, take care then.
All right. Look after yourself, mate. Catch you later.
Bye now.